It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Conversations with Joan. Conversations with Joan will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Conversations with Joan. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. Conversations with Joan focuses on topics that are important to your life, from health and wellness to professional development to personal well-being. Thought leaders and experts join me to share their insights, tips, and strategies so you can thrive and live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. Now, let's start talking. Losing someone you care about can be painful and traumatic. The thought of continuing on with your life without this person by your side is often overwhelming and can leave you feeling hopeless. Joining me to talk about how we can navigate the loss, release regrets, and feel hopeful again is David Kessler, a grief and loss specialist. David is the author of 5 best-selling books, including 2 with Elisabeth Kübler-Ross on grief and grieving and life lessons. His first book, The Needs of the Dying, received praise by Mother Teresa. David is a contributing writer for Oprah.com and Dr. Oz's ShareCare.com. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
So glad to be with you.
So, David, when a person experiences loss, whether it's due to death, divorce, breakup, it can be life-changing and overwhelming. And I know this firsthand because about 8 years ago, in a period of 6 months, my 23-year marriage ended, my mother died, and my sister passed away. And I experienced such deep grief that from day to day, I often didn't even know what it was I was grieving. And it wasn't that I wanted to die. It was just that I didn't know how to live. And I know many people experience similar type feelings. So I want to start off with how you got focused on this type of work. What put you on the journey of helping people heal from loss?
Well, like you, I was a student of loss too. I was 13 years old when my mother was dying, and at the same time she was dying, at the hospital where she was dying and the hotel next door, there was a mass shooting. So at 13 years old, I found myself in the middle of a mass shooting that went on for 13 hours. It was one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. So I watched police officers die, first responders, hotel guests, and then my own mother. So I had a lot of death early on. And I spent decades trying to find my way through it and was able to do it and wanted to really pass on all the things that I had learned to help others get through the pain, live again, even find happiness again. Now, when you're in grief, that seems impossible, and I understand it, but there is help out there and ways out.
You and I are both examples that there is a way through it, and you can find joy and happiness again. But you're right, when you're going through it, you don't feel that that's possible. So I want to talk a little bit about the stages of what people are feeling so that they can better understand these emotions. So there are 5 stages of grief. Let's talk about what each is and just maybe a little bit of background and description about what someone might expect while in that stage.
Sure. So psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who was my teacher, identified the stages of dying in her first book on death and dying. And decades later, her and I adapted those same stages for grief. One of the things that Elisabeth and I want to say, and we share in the book, is these stages are not a map for grief. Everyone's grief is different. We don't have to do them in exact order, but they do seem to occur naturally. So, and, Elisabeth was the first one to say, if these don't resonate with you, it's fine. Just deal and feel your feelings. So the stages are denial, the disbelief, I can't believe they're gone, that shock that we go through. Then the next stage is anger. And we live in an anger-denying society. We don't like other people's anger. There's not a lot of permission to have anger these days. It's fascinating to me that we allow ourselves to be angry about traffic, but we don't allow ourselves to be angry when someone dies. The next stage is bargaining. And bargaining before someone dies is the please God, let me have 5 more years with her. I'm going to be a better husband, a better man. After death, bargaining becomes all those what ifs, all the regrets we have. And those can be tremendously hard to deal with and haunting, when we feel guilty that maybe if we had done one thing different, they would still be here. And then we have depression. And we have pathologized depression. There's a word we don't use anymore. We don't use the word sadness. And in Kübler-Ross's day, sadness and depression were really one and the same. But now they've gone off in 2 different directions, and we don't really allow ourselves to be sad. And when we talk about depression after a loss, we're talking about situational depression. Someone has died, and that's the situation. And that situation is depressing. And our society's message these days around depression is you're broken and you need help because you can't make it through this. My message is you are not broken. You come from a long line of dead people, and you have the strength, just like your ancestors and your great-grandparents, to get through this. And I want to give you lots of tools and resources to help you get through this because you can. And it's going to be devastating, but you can get through this. And then we have acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you like the loss. It doesn't mean you're okay with the loss. It just means you acknowledge the reality of the loss. So those are the 5 stages. I'm actually in the process of writing a new book about the 6th stage, which I believe is the stage of meaning, that we're also a generation that we want to find and make meaning after a loss.
2 points. The first one, when you were talking about depression, I think we're so hard on ourselves. And you're right, we don't allow ourselves to feel. We get so caught up in the people around us who start to say, it's been 5 months, it's been a year, isn't it time for you to move on? And when we hear that, and then I'll get to my second point, but when someone says that to us, when we are feeling sad, and rightly so, we've had a deep relationship with someone that we've loved, and that person is no longer in our life. When we're feeling sad and someone says to us, isn't it time for you to move on? How do we address that?
Well, Joan, when people say, how long are they going to grieve? How long is this going to go on? I sometimes will say, how long is the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. Now, that doesn't mean you will always grieve with pain. In time, we can grieve with love. We can just miss them and send them sweet thoughts, and they will always have a soft spot in our heart. But we don't have to be in pain. But you're so right. Our friends, our society says you've got 3 days, says you should be done in a year, and that's not how grief works.
And when people say that to us, David, people tend to withdraw and they no longer share their feelings because they figure, I don't have anyone to talk to about this anymore.
And that's why we're finding that grief support groups are so helpful. Being online is helpful. There's a lot of groups now online. I have online courses and groups that people can be in. There's lots of different ways to connect now. And, sometimes your friends, your husband, your wife might not be the best grief support person for you. And the other thing I tell people is, they haven't had your loss. They haven't lost a sister, a child, a husband, and they have a different style of grieving than you. They haven't experienced it. They might not know. So you just have to know if they say something stupid, they just don't know. They don't mean to hurt you. They just don't know.
And David, the second point that I wanted to bring up when you were talking about the 6th stage being meaning, I am in total agreement. I see that in my life. And as you described, your life took on meaning because of your grief, and I'm doing the work that I'm doing. I'm talking to you today because of my grief. So I can see how that can be extremely important in all of our lives.
Absolutely. And we're shaped by our griefs the same way our great-grandparents and our parents were. And we also want to do grief well so that we pass it on to generations in a healthy way, not in an unhealthy way.
And David, I think an important thing to note about these stages, as I said, I'm 8 years down the road now from that very traumatic period in my life. And 90% of the time, I'm doing very well. I've moved through it. But then every once in a while, there's a trigger. And it's like it happened yesterday, and I'm right back in the stages. I'm going through them all. So is it a natural progression, or is it just natural to have these stages occur for an expanded period of our life once we have the loss?
Well, think of it, in your case that, of course, when your mother or your sister's birthday comes up, why wouldn't you have feelings again about that? When something comes up that reminds you of your loved ones who died, why wouldn't that, impact you? I mean, the love you had was real, so of course it's going to impact you. Now, the key is a lot of times people talk about grief bursts. They're doing fine, they're doing well, and then all of a sudden they have this burst of grief. And I try to teach people to begin to notice, was it a grief burst or a love burst? Because early on in grief, and you know what I call early grief? I call early grief the first 2 years. Early on in grief, when you have those triggers, those memories, all of a sudden you might burst into tears. In time, you might just see your mother's favorite flowers blooming, and you have this burst of love. So just know, we will always remember them. We always will love them. That's natural, and we wouldn't want it any other way if you think about it.
David, I was looking at the list on grief.com, your site, of the worst things that people can say when someone is experiencing grief. And I have to tell you, these are things that I'm guilty of saying and people have said to me. So can you share some of the things that may not be the best things that we can say to help someone move through this?
Sure. Well, you want to, first of all, that page on grief.com is one of the most visited pages because we're not taught what to say. We don't know what to say. So I'm so glad people do visit that page to learn things. So some of the best things and worst things, some of the worst things are anything that minimizes or judges a grief. At least they lived a long life. At least they're not sick anymore. At least you can have more children. Any sentence that begins with at least is going to be minimizing. And what we want in our grief that we really need to heal is grief must be witnessed. We want at least one other person to witness our grief, to just see our pain without trying to point out the silver lining or the bright side. So things go wrong when we don't see someone's pain and we just say, oh, well, aren't you glad they lived to 100 years? Don't be sad. Or, be strong. Be strong really means don't have feelings. Or at least it was just a miscarriage. I mean, some of these things, we don't mean to say things that are harsh, but we don't realize how harsh they are for someone in grief. And some of the best things we can say to people is, I don't have the right words, but just know I'm here with you. And I'm going to be walking along your side with you as you go through this. Or tell them a favorite story of their loved one. Or just sit and hold their hand. But let go of that need to point out the silver lining and fix the person. The person's not broken. They're in grief.
David, what about survivor's guilt? How do we know when it's okay to perhaps date again or to even allow yourself to feel happy? I know when I was going through it, I would constantly remind myself of the loss. It was almost like my way to honor them, that I felt if I was too happy or moving forward, it was like I was forgetting the person I loved. And I think a lot of people may feel the same way. So how do we give ourselves permission to move forward and love again and not feel like we have to cry? And when we're happy, we're not betraying our loved person.
Well, it's so true what you say, that sense of betrayal comes up, that we're betraying them, that we have no right to be happy when they died. So a lot of times when I work with people, I'll mention things like, tell me why maybe you think you should have died and your loved one should have lived. And they will always tell me, my loved one deserved more happiness. My loved one deserved more time. My loved one still had purpose. My loved one had more to do. And I'll turn all those things right back on the person in grief and say, isn't that true for you too? Don't you deserve more happiness? Don't you deserve more time? Don't you have more to do here? And they'll just feel so bad that their loved ones have died and they are continuing to live, or they get to have happiness. And sometimes I'll say to them, what if the tables were turned? What if you had died and your loved one had lived? Would you wish them to be paralyzed because of your loss? Would you wish them another 40 years of emptiness? Or would you want your loved one to be happy?
David, how do we know when the grief is too much for us to go it alone? What are some signs that maybe we should seek some help?
Sure. Well, first of all, that is part of grieving, is this overwhelming terrain. I mean, grief is supposed to turn our world upside down. So when our world gets turned upside down, we do have this feeling that something's wrong, but that is what grief looks like. Now, sometimes people will say to me, because I teach a lot of therapists how to deal with grief and loss with their clients. And they'll go, I have a client that can't get out of bed. And I'll go, when? Because if they can't get out of bed 3 days after the death, that might be normal. If they tell me they come home from work and they crawl into bed on the weekend a month after the death, that might be normal. Now, Monday morning, if you're missing work, and it's been a month or 2 months and you're not able to complete the activities of daily living, then you might want to get help. Now, it doesn't mean if you go to work, you're going to be sharp as a tack. We talk about things like grief brain or grief fog. I mean, grief makes it hard to concentrate. We're not going to be our best selves, but we're going to be our authentic, loving selves that miss someone so much. So partly, we don't know what grief looks like, so we think something is wrong. But certainly, if you go to grief.com, there's a directory of therapists in your area usually. There's also a place on grief.com to look up groups in your area, free groups that you can attend. And there's so much help online. So I encourage anyone who feels like they do need help or they are having trouble just doing what needs to be done in their life, just seek help.
And again, David's site is grief.com, and I do encourage our listeners to visit his site. There are programs, there are resources, there's so much information there that can be helpful to you. And David, you're going to be in New York on October 28th at the New York Open Center. Can you tell us a little bit about that program?
I'm so excited. I love the Open Center in New York, so I'm thrilled to be back there. And I'm going to be doing an evening about talking more about these tools and how we can remember more with love than pain. And, I say one of the things I try to teach people is how pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. You're always going to miss your loved ones, but I don't want you to suffer needlessly. And there's things you can do to really release the pain and find the love and have a pure sense of grief rather than that horrible suffering, blaming, guilty grief. So that evening is going to be talking about some really practical tools to help people. And I want to chat with people and answer questions. And I think it's just going to be a really inspiring, wonderful evening. And I really encourage people to let their friends know about it. Because by the way, everyone has a friend who's struggling with grief. So I really encourage them to check this out because it's going to be a special night.
And again, that's October 28th at the New York Open Center. David, what would you like our listeners to remember from this conversation?
I would love them to know that they don't have to be alone in their grief, that there are others out there who understand, that they're not broken. And I would love them to know the pain and the grief they are feeling is because they loved. And most people, if we have the choice to have just never known our loved one and skip the pain, we'd rather take the pain to have the joy of knowing them. So to know what you're going through is normal, but you don't have to be alone, and there is help out there. And there's also people who can witness your pain. And I hope that people who are listening today will see that we are feeling their pain and witnessing their pain.
David, thank you so much for being here with us today. As I said, I have lived this, and I know what that pain is like, but I also know that there is hope once you're able to go on with your life. And as you said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. So thank you for being here, for sharing some ways that we can learn to release the pain and feel the love. I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm so happy that you were here today to have it with me.
Oh, Joan, thank you so much for doing it. I mean, when you have these kind of conversations, you are helping so many people. I wish there were more like you out there.
Thank you for that, David. This is Conversations with Joan. Stay with us. We'll be right back.